She's been feeding our project files to Vantage Capital for months. My brother set his fork down when he said it. He looked at my father, not at me. He already knew where the impact was going to land, and it wasn't going to land on himself. My father turned in his chair at the head of the table. The whole room went still. My aunt, my uncle, their kids, my mother, 3 cousins who had driven up from Hamilton for the long weekend. All of them going quiet the way people do when they sense something is about to break, and they don't want to be in the way of the pieces. Outside the windows of the family house in Oakville, the October wind was doing what Ontario wind does in Thanksgiving weekend, pushing hard against everything, stripping the last leaves off the maples. "Is that true?" my father asked me. I had been about to say something. I had the words ready, actually. I had spent 3 months preparing words, building a file, collecting documentation I hadn't yet shown anyone because I wanted to be certain before I was damaging. I had found invoice irregularities. Numbered companies that didn't exist outside a corporate registry. Payments approved for renovation work that had no corresponding inspection records. I had wanted to bring it to the board properly, with evidence instead of suspicion, so no one could dismiss it as a family disagreement. My brother had been faster. I started to answer. My father raised one hand, and that was the end of it. He looked around the table like he was making a formal announcement. "You're no longer employed by Harwick Properties," he said, "and you're no longer welcome in this house." My aunt looked at her plate. My uncle poured more wine. My mother sat very still with her hands in her lap. I put my napkin on the table. I got my coat from the front closet. I walked out into the cold October air and got in my car and sat there in the dark of the driveway for a long time before I was able to start the engine and drive. 4 days later, the lease payment processing for every commercial address Harwick Properties operated out of across the GTA stopped going through. My father spent most of that Monday morning convinced someone had hacked his banking system. He was wrong. The disruption had a name. It was mine. My name is Darcy. I am 32 years old, and for 8 years I worked as the compliance and operations officer at my father's mid-sized commercial real estate development firm. My father built Harwick Properties starting from a single industrial plaza in Burlington, and by the time I joined straight out of my finance degree, it was managing over $40 million in active development projects across Ontario. My job was to find problems before they became disasters, billing anomalies, invoices without supporting documentation, approvals that moved too fast for the numbers to have been checked. I was good at it. I liked the work. I told myself for years that the particular friction of being inside a family business was normal. My brother was the favorite. He always had been. He was 5 years older, had come home from business school in Montreal full of a confidence that my father mistook for competence, and had been quietly positioned as the company's future since before I even joined. I understood that. I wasn't competing with him for that particular role. I was just doing my job. Which is why, about 8 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, when renovation invoices started arriving on the Brampton mixed-use conversion I was managing, a project I had shepherded from the first zoning meeting to the final occupancy permit, I didn't assume anything sinister at first. I looked up the contractors. Numbered companies. 1847329 Ontario Inc. 2093741 Alberta Limited. Identical registration dates. The same registered agent. Business addresses that resolved to mail forwarding services. No employees. No websites. No presence anywhere except inside our accounts payable. I started saving documents quietly. Encrypted. Bank statements, payment records, approval chains. I was building something airtight before I said a word to anyone, because I understood exactly how it would be received if I brought an accusation instead of a case. My brother brought his accusation first, and he didn't need any documentation at all. He just needed my father to be listening, which my father always was, whenever it was my brother doing the talking. I drove home to Mississauga that Thanksgiving Sunday with my coat and my keys and nothing else. I sat in my kitchen until 2 in the morning trying to understand how completely and quickly everything had collapsed. Then my phone lit up with an encrypted message from a law firm in Ottawa, Whitfield Car Trust and Estate Law. They needed to confirm my identity regarding a matter connected to the estate of my grandmother, who had passed 6 months earlier. My grandmother had come to Canada from Trinidad in the 1970s with very little, and she had built something slowly over 40 years, or so the family story went, vaguely, in the way family stories do when nobody asks specific questions. She had worked as a seamstress in Hamilton, then managed a building, then at some point started owning small commercial units. She lived in the same modest house she'd bought in 1984, and she never discussed money. When she passed, we assumed she had left a quiet estate, the house, some savings, a few pieces of good jewelry. We were wrong by approximately $82 million. I flew to Ottawa 2 days after Thanksgiving. The lawyers met me in a clean, still office near the Rideau Center and spent an hour explaining something I had to ask them to repeat twice before it fully resolved. My grandmother had spent 4 decades quietly assembling a commercial property portfolio across Ontario, 23 properties, warehouses in Hamilton and Stony Creek, retail plazas in Cambridge, office units in Mississauga and Brampton, all of it held inside a private holding company she had registered under the name Marstone Holdings, named, one of the lawyers told me softly, for the street in Port of Spain where she had grown up. She had never told anyone, not my father, not his siblings, not anyone. And then the lawyer said the thing that made me grip the edge of the table. Harwick Properties, my father's company, the one I had just been removed from, did not own most of the addresses it operated out of. It leased them, and a significant portion of those leases, the most operationally critical ones, the ones tied to active project management suites and warehouse staging, were held through Marstone Holdings. My grandmother had been my father's landlord for 20 years, and she had never once mentioned it. She had watched her son's company grow up inside her buildings. She had watched him promote people based on loyalty instead of ability. She had watched what happened to the people who were careful and honest and thorough in that company, and she had decided, years before she passed, to do something about it that couldn't be undone. The trust agreement named me as her successor trustee, effective upon verification of my identity and acceptance of the appointment. As trustee, I held full operational authority over Marstone Holdings, all lease agreements, all disbursements, all financial decisions. There was one additional clause. If the successor trustee had credible evidence of financial misconduct involving any entity connected to Marstone Holdings, she held full legal authority to immediately suspend all lease payment processing, pending an independent forensic review. No court approval, no board vote, one signature on one authorization form. I sat there with that document in my hands for a long time. 72 hours earlier, my father had told me in front of everyone at that table that I was no longer his daughter. And now I was looking at papers that made me effectively the landlord of his entire operation. I didn't sign anything that afternoon. I needed the picture to be complete before I acted, because acting too early would only create noise. I wanted evidence that would make it impossible for anyone to look away afterward. The trust's forensic accounting team was already on retainer. I authorized them to begin, and handed over everything I had collected. Every suspicious invoice, every numbered company, every payment approval without a corresponding site report. 6 days later, they put a full report on the table in front of me. My brother had built a network of 7 shell companies, incorporated across Ontario and Alberta, that appeared in Harwick's accounts payable as renovation and consulting contractors. They submitted invoices for services that were never performed. The invoices were approved, consistently, quickly, without additional documentation requests. The payments moved through intermediate accounts and ultimately landed in holdings, connected to the business school network of people my brother had been close to for 15 years. The whole structure was designed to look, from the outside, like routine contractor payments in a busy development company. The forensic team had also found the transfer schedule. $18 million CAD had been set to process over the Thanksgiving long weekend, when CRA field offices were operating on reduced holiday staff, and large interprovincial transactions were statistically less likely to receive immediate scrutiny. By the time the business week resumed, the money would have been effectively untraceable. My brother had needed me gone before that weekend. I was the compliance officer. I was the one systematically reviewing the invoices. The dinner table accusation hadn't been anger or family politics. It had been an operational necessity. I looked at the authorization form for a long time. Then I asked the lawyers to wait until the transfer had entered the banking queue. On Friday evening, when the $18 million was in motion, I signed. The Marstone Holdings emergency suspension clause activated the moment the signature processed. Automated notifications went to 4 financial institutions simultaneously. The wire transfer flagged and halted before a single dollar moved. Lease payment processing for 11 Harwick addresses stopped mid-cycle. Accounts linked to those lease agreements were suspended pending forensic review. By Monday morning, my father's company couldn't pay its contractors. A delivery to the Burlington warehouse was refused because attached invoices were flagged. Project managers across 3 active sites were logging into systems and seeing the same word, suspended. My father's assistant called 4 different banks and received the same answer from each of them. The accounts were under a legal suspension, pending independent audit, initiated by a named trustee with appropriate authority. I heard later that my father spent most of that Monday convinced he'd been hacked. He had the office locks changed. He brought in a cybersecurity consultant. He was loud and certain and completely wrong about every aspect of it. My brother posted something on LinkedIn about organizational resilience in the face of external threats. He sounded calm and measured and appropriately concerned. He was very good at that. He had been very good at it for years. Then the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit contacted the company's corporate lawyers, and the narrative about external threats became significantly harder to sustain. Banks are required to report certain anomalies. A halted wire transfer, connected to accounts flagged under an emergency trust suspension, connected to shell company structures with no operational presence. That combination generates mandatory reporting without anyone needing to make a phone call. While my father was still looking for an invisible enemy, I was sitting in a rented meeting room in downtown Toronto with the forensic team, working through 11 years of Harwick records. Every invoice, every shell company, every signature on every approval chain. And then we found something I hadn't been looking for. In archived project files, old records no one had touched during internal audits, the forensic team found a pattern in how official documents had been revised over time. Project leadership attributions had been changed, specifically and repeatedly. The Brampton mixed-use conversion I had managed from first zoning meeting to final occupancy permit was listed under my brother's name in the company's official submission to the Ontario Ministry of Housing. A commercial retrofit in Etobicoke that I had negotiated and delivered in 2021 was credited to him in the industry award application my father submitted that year. A site efficiency program I had designed and implemented across 4 active properties appeared nowhere in my performance record, but appeared prominently in my brother's. The forensic team pulled the authorization logs for each change. Every single revision had been processed through the same administrative account and signed off by the same approver. My father's signature was on every one. He hadn't failed to notice what was happening. He had documented it himself. I had spent years wondering why my results never seemed to translate into recognition, why I worked longer and solved bigger problems and accepted the hardest assignments, and was consistently told, in performance reviews I now know were rewritten before they reached the board, that my brother had outperformed me. I had turned that confusion inward for years, questioning my own work, my own judgment. The answer had been in a file this whole time, bearing my father's signature. My brother's career had been built, in part, on projects I had delivered. My father had built that fiction carefully and deliberately, one alteration at a time, for years. The shareholder meeting was called for the following Wednesday. By then enough had leaked that reporters were standing outside the building when directors arrived. I walked into that boardroom, and the room went quiet in a way that had its own texture. That particular silence of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. My father looked at me across the table. "You have no standing in this meeting," he said. "This is a session for shareholders." The senior partner from the Ottawa firm placed sealed document packages in front of every person at the table. As the controlling successor trustee of Marstone Holdings, which held master leases on addresses representing the operational backbone of the company, I had both standing and formal notice rights at any meeting materially affecting those lease agreements. The documentation had been reviewed by 2 independent legal opinions and was registered with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. What followed over the next hour was not dramatic in the way I might have imagined. It was simply methodical. The forensic report was entered into the record. The shell company network was laid out in plain language with documentation attached. The altered project records were presented alongside the originals. The authorization logs with my father's signature were displayed. My brother sat very still while the documents went around the table. He turned the pages slowly, the way someone does when they're looking for an error that isn't there. His face went through several things in a short period of time. He stood up partway through and said he needed to step out briefly. He didn't come back. By then, his legal representative had already been in contact with the RCMP unit handling the file. The vote to remove my father as managing director passed 9-1. His was the only vote against. He sat in his chair after the vote without speaking. That particular silence, the absence of the energy that had always filled every room he entered, was something I hadn't expected to feel the way I felt it. I stood for the remainder of the meeting. When it ended, I gathered my materials, said goodbye to the lawyers, and walked to my car in the parking garage alone. I sat in the car for a while. I didn't feel the way I thought I would. I felt lighter than I expected, and quieter, and very tired. My mother called the next afternoon and asked to meet for coffee. She looked exhausted in a way that had been building for a long time. She held her mug in both hands and told me she had known about the project attributions, not the financial fraud. The shell companies were news to her, she said, and I believe that. But she had been at the industry dinner where my brother received an award for the Etobicoke retrofit. She had sat at that table knowing the project was mine. She had seen my name missing from documents it should have appeared on. She had understood what it meant, and she had said nothing, because she was afraid that saying something would fracture the family in ways that couldn't be repaired. And she had decided that preserving the surface of the family was worth more than speaking up for her daughter. I asked her what she had thought would happen, eventually. She didn't answer that. I told her I loved her and that I was angry, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and probably would be for a long time. I told her that the silence at the dinner table was something I could understand. Fear makes people freeze, that's human. What was harder to hold was knowing that she had watched me doubt myself for years, that she had held the one piece of information that would have answered the questions I kept turning inward. And she had kept it, because the alternative felt like too much disruption. We sat quietly for a while after that, which felt appropriate. 6 weeks later, my assistant told me someone was waiting in reception and had asked for me specifically. When I came out, my father was sitting near the window. He looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe just more accurately sized without the particular authority that had always surrounded him. I took him into my office. He had personally guaranteed 2 development loans against Harwick's performance projections that were now under audit and under revision. The banks had called those guarantees. Legal costs were compounding. He told me it wasn't sustainable. He reminded me that family was supposed to help each other through the hard parts, and that whatever had happened between us, we were still family. I listened until he finished. Then I asked him one question. Did he remember what he had said at Thanksgiving? He looked at the window. I repeated his words back to him evenly, that I was no longer employed by his company, and no longer welcome in his home, that he had said it at a table full of people without asking me a single question, that it hadn't been a private moment of anger. It had been a public decision, made in front of everyone, and it had ended something before I had made a single business decision in response to it. Everything that happened afterward had been the consequence of choices he and my brother had made. I hadn't created those consequences. I had simply stopped absorbing them. I told him I genuinely wished him well, and I meant it, but I was not going to rescue him from what he had built. He nodded once slowly. He stood up and paused at the door like he was going to say something more. Then he left. I stayed at my desk for a while in the quiet. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd once imagined I would in some version of this moment. I felt something cleaner than that, the particular freedom of a decision fully made. The company's restructuring took months. I brought in an independent management team and refused every offer to sell the operation outright. There were people who had worked for Harwick for 15 and 20 years. Project coordinators, site managers, office staff who had done their jobs honestly and had nothing to do with the fraud. They deserved continuity. The restructuring gave it to them. Promotions were reviewed and realigned with actual project records. Performance incentives were tied to documented contributions. 3 people who had been doing excellent, unrecognized work for years received positions they had earned a long time ago. The atmosphere in the offices changed gradually. People who had kept their heads down started contributing ideas again, because for the first time in a long while, it seemed like ideas were what actually mattered. By spring, new contracts were coming in. Investors who had paused returned. The company was rebuilding on something more durable than reputation alone. Canadian Thanksgiving came around again the following October, the second Monday of the month. That particular gray-blue autumn weekend that smells like wood smoke and wet leaves and someone's oven running since early morning. I hosted dinner for the first time in my life, in my Mississauga apartment with its not quite large enough dining table, and 2 folding tables pushed against it to fit everyone. The people around those tables were not the people I had grown up with. They were colleagues who had believed me before the evidence was public. 2 friends from university who had shown up the previous October with groceries and wine, and the good sense not to ask too many questions until I was ready to answer them. The senior estate lawyer from Ottawa who had spent decades quietly admiring my grandmother's precision, and felt, I think, that watching me take that boardroom meeting had been a kind of completion for him. A neighbor from my floor who had knocked on my door one evening, during the worst of it, holding a container of soup, and who had said, simply, that the pot had been too large for one person. The food was not perfect. One dish was aggressively overseasoned, and someone's pie filling had bubbled over the edge of the crust and burned onto the oven rack, and the folding table wobbled on one end whenever anyone set something down with emphasis. It was the best dinner I had ever sat down to. Before everyone arrived, I had written 2 letters at my kitchen counter with a real pen, which felt like the right instrument. One to my father, one to my mother. I told them both the same essential thing in different words, that I was not writing from anger, though the anger had been real, and would probably take more time to fully settle than I could predict. That I understood how people talk themselves into silence in the name of keeping something intact, even when the thing being kept intact isn't what they think it is. That I was choosing to move forward, not because what had happened was acceptable, but because I had already given it a significant portion of my life, and I was choosing not to give it more. I wished them both well, and I sealed the envelopes and set them aside for a courier that afternoon. When everyone was seated, someone suggested we go around the table and each say one thing we were grateful for. When my turn came, I looked at the faces around me for a moment before I answered. My grandmother, I said, for watching quietly for 40 years and deciding, at the end of it, to trust me with something she had built with her whole life. Most people at that table didn't fully know what I meant by that. That was fine, I knew. I raised my glass and everyone raised theirs, and outside the October wind was doing what Ontario wind always does in the fall, moving through everything, taking what's ready to go, making space. I had spent a long time believing that proving myself meant making the right people finally see the truth. What I understand now is that the truth had always existed. My grandmother had organized her entire life around it. She had watched and waited and structured everything with extraordinary patience, not to punish her son, but to ensure that when things finally broke the way she believed they would, there would be someone in position to protect the people who deserved protection. She chose me, and I had carried it through. The table was full, the food was warm, the pie, burned edges and all, was eaten down to the tin, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I was somewhere that felt entirely like home. Not because of the address or the furniture, or whose name was on the lease, but because every person sitting there had chosen to be present, genuinely, without agenda. And so had I. That, it turned out, was the only thing that had ever mattered.